His private existence was a criminal offense punishable by brutal hard labor and total societal ruin. Yet, he received a glorious state funeral, his coffin draped in honors, while the entire British Empire mourned. He was John Campbell. This is the story of the Duke of Argyll, the gay blackmail and crown heist King Edward VII tried to bury. Why would a sovereign king willingly sacrifice a priceless national treasure just to keep one man's reality hidden in the shadows? The catalyst for this extraordinary cover-up occurred in the summer of 1907. Inside the heavily fortified walls of Dublin Castle, an unthinkable breach took place. The Irish crown jewels, a breathtaking assembly of 394 diamonds, rubies, and emeralds, vanished from a steel safe. This unparalleled breach was a direct assault on the symbolic authority of the British Empire over Ireland. The immediate response is a mobilization of the finest investigative minds at Scotland Yard, driven by the fury of King Edward VII. The detectives are relentless. They meticulously track the movements of every guard, every key holder, and every visitor. The net tightens around a single, undeniable suspect. Yet, precisely at the moment the trap is meant to spring, the investigation is paralyzed. An executive order descending directly from the highest echelons of Buckingham Palace demands the immediate cessation of all police activity regarding the prime suspect. The thief is granted safe passage. The stolen heritage is abandoned to the shadows. This paradox defies every principle of British justice. A monarch sworn to protect the realm deliberately sabotages his own legal apparatus to shield a criminal. The motive behind this institutional self-destruction lies hidden in a blackmail threat so potent it could dismantle the moral foundation of the monarchy. The ransom demanded was absolute silence, and the name weaponized in this threat is John Campbell, the 9th Duke of Argyll, brother-in-law to the king himself. John Campbell was born into an inheritance of absolute privilege and inescapable duty. As the heir to the Dukedom of Argyll, he represented one of the most ancient and formidable aristocratic houses in Scotland. His life was heavily architected from birth to serve the interests of the crown. In 1871, this architectural design culminated in his marriage to Princess Louise, the 4th daughter of Queen Victoria. The union was celebrated as a triumph of domestic political strategy, binding a powerful Scottish lineage directly to the royal bloodline. Campbell was thrust into the blinding center of imperial power. He was a son-in-law to an era-defining queen and later brother-in-law to a king. Outwardly, the Duke was the ultimate manifestation of Victorian nobility. He was wealthy, erudite, and politically active, serving as the Governor-General of Canada and holding a seat in Parliament. He moved through the world draped in the heavy velvet of state expectations, performing the precise rituals required of a man of his station. The reality within the walls of Kensington Palace was a portrait of profound alienation. Historical archives and private correspondences reveal a marriage devoid of romantic intimacy. The Duke and Princess Louise lived increasingly parallel lives, their public appearances a carefully choreographed performance, masking a hollow domestic existence. They produced no children. The emotional chasm between them was an open secret among the elite, yet it was never acknowledged, buried beneath the rigid protocol of royal duty. Campbell found himself trapped in a gilded panopticon. He was a man forced to embody an archaic ideal of aristocratic masculinity while privately wrestling with an identity that the state had criminalized. Late 19th century Britain was defined by an atmosphere of suffocating moral conservatism. The passing of the Labouchere Amendment in 1885 codified this intolerance, making all acts of gross indecency between men punishable by severe terms of hard labor. The law was a blunt instrument of terror, utilized to purge society of anyone who deviated from strict heteronormative standards. It destroyed careers, dismantled families, and drove countless men to exile or suicide. The trial and subsequent destruction of Oscar Wilde served as a brutal public warning. To be discovered as a homosexual was to face social and legal annihilation. For a member of the royal family, such a revelation would be an apocalyptic event, an unforgivable betrayal of the moral purity that Queen Victoria had painstakingly constructed as the justification for monarchical rule. Beneath the suffocating weight of these expectations, the Duke of Argyll carved out a hidden existence. He sought refuge in a clandestine network of aristocratic men who shared his secret reality. This was a fragile, dangerous underworld, operating in the shadow of the gallows. The Duke frequently absented himself from his wife's side, leaving the stifling atmosphere of the royal court to immerse himself in private gatherings in London and Dublin. The network provided a temporary sanctuary from the relentless performance of his public life, a place where the heavy armor of his title could be momentarily discarded. But this sanctuary was built on perilous ground. The men he associated with were protected only by their wealth and their titles, a fragile shield against a ruthless legal system. One of the central figures in this subterranean world was Francis Shackleton. Shackleton was a man constructed entirely of contradictions. He possessed the polished charm and refined manners required to navigate high society. Yet he was perpetually teetering on the edge of financial ruin. While his brother Ernest Shackleton was etching his name into history as a heroic Antarctic explorer, Francis was busy cultivating a very different kind of reputation. He held the prestigious, if largely ceremonial, title of Dublin Herald, a position that granted him unfettered access to the inner workings of Dublin Castle. Behind his prestigious title, Shackleton was a grifter, sustaining a lavish lifestyle on borrowed money and empty promises. He was also a prominent orchestrator of the underground homosexual network, arranging private gatherings and facilitating connections among the elite. Shackleton's financial desperation made him a highly volatile element within this fragile ecosystem. He was heavily indebted, facing imminent bankruptcy and social disgrace. Moreover, he was actively being blackmailed by young men he had hired for illicit private gatherings, men who understood the lucrative value of their silence. Shackleton needed a massive influx of capital, and he needed it immediately. He utilized his position as Dublin Herald to meticulously survey the security protocols of Dublin Castle. He identified the vulnerabilities in the system, noting the predictable routines of the guards and the astonishing negligence of the officials tasked with securing the Irish crown jewels. He observed the habits of Arthur Vickers, the Ulster King of Arms, and the man entrusted with the keys to the safe. Vickers was a man deeply compromised by his own incompetence and his close social association with Shackleton. He frequently brought Shackleton into the castle's most secure areas, unwittingly providing a master class in how to breach the vault. The intersection of Shackleton's desperate greed and the Duke of Argyll's hidden life created the perfect conditions for a catastrophic security failure. Dublin Castle, the fortress of British administration in Ireland, was simultaneously serving as a covert gathering place for members of this aristocratic ring. The very individuals trusted to uphold the law and protect the empire's treasures were utilizing the castle's secluded quarters to engage in activities the state deemed criminal. Shackleton exploited this deeply compromised environment. He navigated the corridors of power not as an outsider breaking in, but as an insider who had been handed the keys. The theft of the jewels was a masterpiece of internal betrayal. It relied entirely on the arrogant assumption of the elite that they were immune to consequences, that their private transgressions would forever remain insulated from public scrutiny. When the safe was discovered open and empty on the morning of July 6, 1907, the illusion of security shattered. The meticulous investigation led by Scotland Yard's Chief Inspector John Campbell rapidly unspooled Shackleton's web of deceit. Campbell dismantled Shackleton's alibis, exposed his crushing debts, and laid bare his connections to the blackmailers. The detective gathered enough evidence to secure a conviction. The trap was set. Shackleton was cornered, but instead of surrendering, he leveraged the ultimate weapon he possessed, his intimate knowledge of the Duke of Argyll's private life. Shackleton understood that the true power of the monarchy did not lie in its jewels or its armies, but in its carefully curated image of moral superiority. Many historians believe he threatened to expose this underground network in a public courtroom, effectively forcing the king to choose between the pursuit of justice and the survival of the royal facade. Historical consensus strongly suggests an ultimatum was delivered by Francis Shackleton, striking the very foundation of the Edwardian establishment with the force of a kinetic weapon. King Edward VII, a monarch who had spent his reign cultivating an image of jovial, untouchable majesty, was suddenly confronted with a crisis that no army or dreadnought could solve. The timing of the threat was as calculated as the theft itself. In 1907, the British Empire was projecting absolute dominance abroad, but internally, the political landscape was dangerously fragile. The movement for Irish Home Rule was gathering aggressive momentum, threatening to tear the United Kingdom apart. Dublin Castle was already viewed by the Irish populace as a symbol of foreign oppression and moral decay. If Shackleton were allowed to testify in open court that the king's own brother-in-law was utilizing this heavily guarded fortress to host illicit underground gatherings, the resulting explosion would not just be a tabloid scandal, it would be a constitutional catastrophe. The monarchy's divine right to rule was predicated on the illusion of moral superiority. Shackleton was holding a match to that illusion, and the king knew that if the fire started, it would consume Princess Louise, the legacy of Queen Victoria, and potentially the stability of the crown itself. Faced with this existential threat, the machinery of the state was immediately and ruthlessly inverted. The objective of the government shifted overnight from recovering the Irish crown jewels to burying the truth of their disappearance. To execute this cover-up, the establishment required a scapegoat, a blood sacrifice to offer the press and the public to create the illusion that action was being taken. The crosshairs fell squarely on Sir Arthur Vickers, the Ulster King of Arms. Vickers was undeniably negligent, a man whose foolish trust in Shackleton had created the opportunity for the heist. However, negligence was his only crime. He was not the thief, and he was completely unaware of the underground sexual network operating beneath his nose. Yet the Crown decided that Vickers would pay the ultimate price. He was ordered to resign his post immediately, taking the full brunt of the public disgrace for the loss of the jewels. Vickers, realizing he was being engineered into a sacrificial lamb to protect men of higher birth, refused to go quietly. He stubbornly demanded a public judicial inquiry, believing that a transparent legal process would clear his name and expose Shackleton as the true culprit. He loudly and repeatedly accused Shackleton of the theft in letters to government officials. This resistance was met with the cold, crushing weight of state power. The government denied him a public trial, offering instead a closed-door commission that Vickers rightfully recognized as a kangaroo court designed solely to rubber-stamp his dismissal. When he refused to participate in the sham proceedings, he was summarily fired, stripped of his pension, and cast out of society. Vickers spent the rest of his life a broken, paranoid man, endlessly protesting his innocence until he was assassinated by the IRA in 1921, a tragic collateral victim of a royal cover-up he never fully comprehended. While Vickers was being publicly eviscerated, the actual investigation led by Chief Inspector John Cain was systematically dismantled from the inside. Cain was a veteran detective, a man who believed in the absolute authority of the law. He had constructed an airtight case against Shackleton, mapping out the financial motives, the timeline, and the intricate web of blackmail that drove the Dublin Herald to steal the national treasure. Cain's comprehensive final report named Shackleton as the prime suspect and detailed the compromised security of Dublin Castle. But this report never saw the inside of a courtroom. Upon reaching the highest levels of the Home Office, the dossier was intercepted and suppressed. Cain received direct, unequivocal orders to halt all surveillance and cease all investigative actions against Francis Shackleton. For a man who had dedicated his life to the pursuit of justice, the realization was staggering. Cain was forced to watch as the architecture of the law was bypassed by the very individuals who commanded it. He was bound by the Official Secrets Act and his oath to the Crown, effectively gagged by the institution he served. The Scotland Yard files were locked away in deep vaults, reclassified to ensure they would not see the light of day for generations. With the scapegoat slaughtered and the police muzzled, the final phase of the operation was the quiet extraction of the threat. Francis Shackleton, having successfully held the British monarchy hostage, was allowed to slip through the dragnet. There were no midnight raids on his London townhouse, no dramatic arrests at the docks. He simply packed his bags and departed the country. The authorities, who possessed the power to track down dissidents across the globe, actively looked the other way as the man who stole the Irish crown jewels boarded a ship and vanished into the European continent. Shackleton's departure brought a collective, silent sigh of relief to the corridors of Buckingham Palace and the secluded estates of the Scottish Highlands. The immediate danger had passed. The Duke of Argyll's secret was secure. The underground network of aristocrats quietly dispersed, its members retreating deeper into the shadows, well aware of how close they had come to total annihilation. The physical jewels were gone, but the Crown had purchased exactly what it paid for: the preservation of its own mythology. The incident left a permanent, invisible scar on the Edwardian era, a stark, undeniable proof that at the apex of society, the law was not an instrument of justice, but merely a weapon of convenience, readily discarded the moment it threatened the survival of the ruling class. The aftermath of Francis Shackleton's quiet departure was characterized by a rapid, almost surgical enforcement of collective amnesia across the upper echelons of British society. In the gentlemen's clubs of St. James's and the drawing rooms of Mayfair, an invisible edict was universally understood. The Irish crown jewels were never to be discussed. To mention the theft was to risk invoking the name of the Duke of Argyll, and to speak of the Duke in connection with the crime was to flirt with treason. The Edwardian elite, masters of the unspoken agreement, simply excised the event from their social reality. King Edward VII resumed his routine of state banquets and diplomatic tours, projecting an aura of undisturbed imperial majesty. The Duke of Argyle continued to stand beside Princess Louise, his public facade completely calcified, betraying no hint of the catastrophic scandal he had just narrowly avoided. The aristocratic network that had operated so brazenly within Dublin Castle dissolved back into the deepest shadows, recognizing that their survival depended entirely on their absolute silence. Behind the closed doors of Whitehall, the bureaucratic machinery of the state was tasked with permanently burying the physical evidence of the investigation. Chief Inspector John Cain returned to London not as a decorated investigator who had solved the crime of the century, but as a man burdened with a state secret he was forbidden to act upon. His meticulous dossiers, containing the sworn statements, the financial records linking Shackleton to the underground network, and the blackmail letters, were gathered by the Home Office. These documents were not filed in the standard archives. They were classified under the highest levels of the Official Secrets Act, bound with red tape, and deposited into deep vaults where they would remain inaccessible to historians and journalists for nearly a century. The official state narrative was sanitized, portraying the theft as an unsolved mystery perpetrated by unknown foreign agents, effectively rewriting history in real time to protect the crown, while the true perpetrators enjoyed the absolute protection of the monarchy. The collateral damage of the cover-up was devastating for those lacking aristocratic armor. Sir Arthur Vickers, the scapegoat sacrificed to appease the public, found himself entirely exiled from the society he had spent his life serving. Stripped of his title, his pension, and his reputation, Vickers retreated to Kilmorna House, an isolated estate in County Kerry, Ireland. His remaining years were consumed by a bitter, obsessive quest for vindication. He wrote hundreds of letters to members of Parliament, to the press, and directly to King Edward VII, detailing Shackleton's guilt and begging for a public inquiry. His pleas were systematically intercepted, ignored, or destroyed. The establishment had already decided his fate, and they viewed his desperate correspondence merely as the ravings of a disgraced official. Vickers descended into paranoia, living in a constant state of fear in a country that was rapidly sliding toward revolution. The tragedy of Arthur Vickers reached its violent conclusion in April 1921. It was the bloody height of the Irish War of Independence. A unit of the Irish Republican Army, viewing Vickers as a remnant of the oppressive British administration, descended upon Kilmorna House. They dragged the aging, broken man from his bed, stood him in front of his home, and shot him dead before burning the estate to the ground. The profound, bitter irony of his death was that the IRA assassinated a man they believed represented the British elite, completely unaware that the elite had already destroyed him 14 years earlier to protect an aristocratic thief. Vickers died carrying the stigma of a crime he did not commit, the final tragic casualty of the Crown's desperate need to preserve its own mythology. Francis Shackleton, the architect of the Blackmail, eventually discovered that the immunity granted by the Crown was specific only to the jewels. The state had protected him from the theft not out of loyalty, but out of necessity. Once the immediate threat to the Duke of Argyll had passed and the files were sealed, Shackleton was no longer of interest to the monarchy. His innate grifter nature inevitably led to his downfall, but on entirely different terms. In 1913, he was arrested and charged with defrauding a wealthy widow of her life savings. During his trial at the Old Bailey, a strange, unspoken tension filled the courtroom. The judge, the prosecution, and the defense strictly adhered to the boundaries of the financial fraud. The events of 1907 in Dublin Castle were never mentioned. The name of the king's brother-in-law was never uttered. Shackleton was convicted of the mundane crime of fraud and sentenced to 15 months of hard labor. The establishment finally discarded him, ensuring he was punished as a common criminal while carefully maintaining the absolute segregation of his past association with the royal family. Upon his release, Shackleton changed his name to Mellor, operated a small obscure antique shop, and eventually faded into complete anonymity, dying unremarked and unremembered. The starkly contrasting fates of the Shackleton brothers reveal the deliberate manipulation of Edwardian history. While Francis Shackleton was being quietly ushered out of the country under the protective silence of the Crown, his older brother was ascending to the highest echelons of imperial glory. Sir Ernest Shackleton was becoming the defining hero of the Edwardian age, a symbol of British endurance and stoic courage on the unforgiving ice of Antarctica. The British establishment, desperate to project an image of unyielding superiority, aggressively championed Ernest's narrative. His expeditions were heavily funded by the very same aristocratic circles that were simultaneously bearing the crimes of his younger brother. This dichotomy serves as a perfect microcosm of the era. On the surface, the empire celebrated the explorer, the man who pushed the boundaries of human endurance in the name of the king. Beneath the surface, it harbored the thief, the man who exploited the moral rot of the elite to steal from that very same king. Ernest's towering legacy was incredibly convenient for the monarchy. The blinding light of his heroism effectively overshadowed the dark, scandalous existence of Francis. It proved that the ruling class could curate the public consciousness simply by directing where the spotlight fell, leaving the shadows unexamined. The sheer magnitude of the monarchy's sacrifice only becomes apparent when one understands exactly what was abandoned in that safe. The Irish crown jewels were not ancient, forgotten relics. They were an active, blindingly brilliant manifestation of power. Commissioned in 1831, the core of the collection was the Grand Star of the Order of St. Patrick. This was not standard royal jewelry. It was forged using hundreds of flawless Brazilian diamonds, arranged around a centerpiece of deep flawless emeralds, and a cross of rubies. These stones carried immense historical weight, having been repurposed from the personal collection of Queen Charlotte. When King Edward VII made the calculated decision to halt Chief Inspector Kane's investigation, he was not merely writing off a financial loss. He was actively discarding his own family's heritage. He was allowing a masterpiece of royal craftsmanship to be dismantled, its silver melted down, and its historic diamonds scattered into the untraceable void of the European black market. The king chose to destroy the physical symbol of his authority in Ireland rather than allow the public to witness the destruction of his brother-in-law's reputation. The jewels were the ransom paid by the British Empire to buy back its own secrets. The abrupt termination of the official inquiry birthed a century of speculation, turning the missing diamonds into one of the most enduring cold cases in European history. In the absence of a trial, the vacuum of information was filled with endless rumors. In the 1920s, unverified diplomatic cables suggested the central ruby cross had been spotted in a Parisian pawn shop, only to vanish before authorities could intervene. Later decades saw the rise of theories claiming the jewels had been seized by Irish Republicans and buried in the Wicklow Mountains to fund the revolution. A narrative that completely ignores the established timeline of Francis Shackleton's movements and the frantic cover-up orchestrated by Whitehall. Even today, amateur historians and treasure hunters periodically petition to unseal the remaining classified documents held by the Home Office. Yet, the bureaucratic seal applied in 1907 remains remarkably intact. The files that survived the purges are heavily redacted, protecting the names of the aristocratic men who attended the gatherings at Dublin Castle. The mystery of the Irish crown jewels endures not because the crime was a work of impenetrable genius, but because the crime scene was meticulously scrubbed clean by the authorities themselves. The saga of the 9th Duke of Argyll, the Dublin Herald, and the stolen diamonds forces a profound re-evaluation of the Edwardian Golden Age. It strips away the velvet curtains, the rigid etiquette, and the grand military parades to reveal a ruling class held completely hostage by its own hypocrisies. The Duke survived his perilous double life not because the society he lived in was secretly tolerant, but because his bloodline rendered him untouchable. The legal apparatus, an entity so ferocious when prosecuting the common man under the Labouchere Amendment, folded entirely when confronted by a royal title. As the modern world looks back at this deliberately buried chapter, the empty steel vault in the Bedford Tower remains the most honest witness to the era. It stands as a chilling monument to the lengths to which absolute power will go to protect itself. The diamonds are gone, but the true legacy of the heist is perfectly preserved. The undeniable proof that justice in the shadow of the throne was always a commodity ready to be traded for silence. King Edward VII sacrificed the empire's physical wealth to bury a scandal, yet he would not live to see the futility of his choice. Less than a decade later, the Easter Rising of 1916 would set Dublin ablaze, and by 1922, the British surrendered control of the very castle where the jewels were stolen. The silence the crown purchased was merely a temporary shield against an empire already beginning to fracture. Within this collapsing world, John Campbell, the 9th Duke of Argyll, lived out his final days not as a man, but as an institution. The royal intervention had saved him from the horrors of a public trial and the brutality of hard labor, but it had sentenced him to a different kind of prison. His survival was entirely conditional upon his absolute adherence to the character he had been assigned at birth. He was forced to become an actor who could never leave the stage. The clandestine network that had briefly offered him a sense of authentic existence was gone, scattered by the terror of Francis Shackleton's blackmail. Campbell was left completely isolated within the echoing halls of his own privilege. He spent his remaining years trapped in a loveless political marriage with Princess Louise, entirely cut off from the emotional and physical realities of his own identity. The state had not merely protected him, it had consumed him. By shielding his secret, the monarchy ensured that the true John Campbell ceased to exist in the eyes of the world. He was reduced to a two-dimensional portrait of nobility, an empty vessel carrying a heavy Scottish title. The man himself was transformed into a ghost long before his physical death in 1914. The complicity of Princess Louise in this tragic theater is a testament to the suffocating nature of royal duty. As the daughter of Queen Victoria, she had been bred to understand that the institution of the monarchy superseded all personal suffering. It is highly probable that she was aware of her husband's orientation and the terrifying blackmail plot that had unfolded at Dublin Castle. Yet she played her part with flawless, chilling perfection. She stood by the Duke, attended the galas, and smiled for the early cameras, actively participating in the burial of her own husband's reality. Her silence was the mortar that held the brickwork of the cover-up together. In this dynamic, we see the true cruelty of the aristocratic system. It did not merely oppress those on the outside with harsh laws and economic disparity. It also devoured its own. It forced its highest-ranking members into a mutual pact of emotional destruction, demanding that they sacrifice their humanity on the altar of public perception. When we examine the official archives of the British government today, the silence surrounding the Dublin Castle affair is deafening. The files remain purged, the police reports redacted, and the diplomatic cables sanitized. This is not an accident of history or a clerical error. It is a deliberate, ongoing mechanism of state power. The establishment recognized that if the mechanics of this cover-up were ever fully exposed, it would provide undeniable proof that the law is not blind. It would show that justice is acutely aware of class, title, and proximity to the throne. The erasure of the 1907 investigation was an act of self-preservation by a ruling class, terrified of its own reflection. By hiding the truth, they sought to maintain the myth that the rules apply equally to all, a myth essential for the pacification of the governed. The missing jewels are the physical proof of this hypocrisy. $1 million void in the historical record that the establishment simply refuses to acknowledge. Ultimately, we do not exhume the story of the Duke of Argyll and the Irish crown jewels to revel in the salacious details of an Edwardian scandal. We dig through the ashes of this cover-up to reclaim a truth that was systematically assassinated by the powerful. We honor the buried reality of this event because it exposes the terrifying mechanics of elite survival. It forces us to confront the fact that a man of supreme power was completely erased, turned into a hollow shadow by his own family, simply to save the face of an empire. The monarchy used its absolute authority to wipe away a national treasure, to destroy an innocent official, and to let a criminal walk free, all to ensure the world never saw the fragile, desperate human beings hiding behind the crown. The true legacy of this story is not the diamonds that disappeared into the dark, but the chilling realization that history is a battlefield where the truth is routinely slaughtered by those who possess the power to write the final chapter. The safe in Dublin Castle remains open and empty, a permanent silent scream against the arrogance of an empire that believed it could simply buy the silence of the ages. The physical space of Dublin Castle underwent a profound transformation just 15 years after Francis Shackleton walked away with the Irish crown jewels. On January 16, 1922, the British administration formally surrendered the fortress to the new provisional government of the Irish Free State. When Michael Collins and his officials walked through the cobblestone courtyards to take possession of the administrative center, they inherited a sprawling complex filled with centuries of imperial history. They also inherited the Bedford Tower and the heavy steel safe embedded within its walls. The British officials handing over the keys were turning over an empty vault. The stark reality of that moment encapsulates the entire legacy of the 1907 cover-up. The British Empire was forced to retreat from Ireland, leaving behind the physical evidence of its own moral bankruptcy. The ruling class had successfully hidden the truth of the theft from the public, but they could not hide the empty safe from the people who eventually reclaimed the castle. The missing jewels represented more than just stolen wealth. They became a permanent, undeniable symbol of a retreating empire that had hollowed itself out from the inside to protect its most privileged members. The Edwardian cover-up created a systemic tragedy that extended far beyond the royal family, devastating the broader society. The Labouchere Amendment of 1885, the law that criminalized all male homosexual activity, did not eradicate the underground networks of London and Dublin. Instead, it created a highly lucrative, sophisticated blackmail economy. By treating human nature as a felony, the state weaponized the justice system against its own citizens. For working class and middle class men, discovery meant immediate arrest, a ruined reputation, the loss of employment, and brutal terms of hard labor in prisons like Reading Jail. Thousands of ordinary lives were systematically destroyed by a legal framework designed to enforce a rigid, artificial standard of Victorian morality. The establishment aggressively prosecuted these individuals, using the full weight of the police and the press to make public spectacles of their suffering. The state presented itself as the unwavering guardian of public decency, willing to purge anyone who deviated from the norm. Yet the survival of the 9th Duke of Argyll exposes this moral crusade as a meticulously constructed fraud. The Edwardian elite did not actually harbor a universal hatred for the acts they criminalized. They only feared the public exposure of those acts when they involved one of their own. When the police dragnet closed in on Francis Shackleton and threatened to expose the clandestine gatherings at Dublin Castle, the establishment immediately suspended the very laws they used to terrorize the public. The Duke's aristocratic title acted as an impenetrable force field. The systemic lesson here is deeply unsettling. The law was never an impartial instrument of justice. It was a mechanism of class control. The ruling elite viewed the criminal code as a weapon meant to regulate the masses while they themselves operated in a realm of absolute impunity. The government was perfectly willing to let a mastermind of theft and blackmail escape justice, fully aware of his crimes, simply because prosecuting him would require the elite to face the consequences of their own legislation. The working class men sent to the galleys paid the price for a moral standard that the royal family completely ignored behind closed doors. The forensic reality of the stolen diamonds further illustrates the calculated nature of the cover-up. Historical consensus strongly suggests the authorities in 1907 understood how the illicit jewel trade operated, yet the investigation was deliberately halted during the crucial window of opportunity when the gems could still have been recovered. Historical records from Scotland Yard outline the established smuggling routes of the era. Within hours of the theft, the Irish crown jewels were likely transported by ferry across the Irish Sea, moved quickly through the criminal networks of London, and shipped across the English Channel. Their final destination was undoubtedly the unregulated cutting houses of Amsterdam or Antwerp. In these dimly lit workshops, the history of the stones was violently erased. The magnificent Brazilian diamonds, originally belonging to Queen Charlotte, were placed under the heavy blades of expert cleavers. The unique historic cuts that made the stones identifiable were sheared away. The diamonds were recut into smaller modern facets, completely destroying their provenance. Once recut, these stones were quietly filtered into the legitimate global diamond market. They were sold to wealthy industrialists in America, minor aristocrats in Europe, and oblivious collectors across the world. The gold and silver settings were melted into anonymous bullion. The authorities understood that a delay of even a few days meant the permanent destruction of the artifact. By ordering Chief Inspector John Cain to stand down, King Edward VII actively condemned the jewels to the cutter's wheel. Today, the diamonds that once symbolized the absolute authority of the British Crown in Ireland are likely sitting in private vaults, mounted on wedding rings, or adorning the necks of people who have no idea they are wearing the fragmented remains of a royal cover-up. The physical destruction of the jewels mirrors the destruction of the truth. Both were meticulously dismantled and scattered to ensure they could never be reassembled. We must also confront the psychological toll exacted upon John Campbell himself. While the state shielded him from prison, it condemned him to a lifelong sentence of profound isolation. The royal intervention did not save his life, it merely preserved his utility as a political prop. Following the terror of 1907, the Duke was forced to retreat entirely behind the rigid mask of his aristocratic duties. The clandestine world that had offered him a fleeting sense of community and authentic connection was permanently shattered, rendered far too dangerous to ever approach again. He spent the final 7 years of his life walking the vast, echoing corridors of his Highland estates and his London residences, accompanied only by the cold, political reality of his marriage to Princess Louise. The tragedy of his existence is the ultimate contradiction of absolute privilege. His bloodline gave him the power to evade the law, but it completely stripped him of the freedom to exist as a human being. He was a captive of the institution he represented. The monarchy protected his title, his wealth, and his public dignity, but it required the complete annihilation of his true self in return. He lived as a ghost, a hollowed-out figurehead, performing a role for a public that was never allowed to know the man behind the medals. This profound erasure culminated in the grand spectacle of his state funeral in 1914. The elaborate ceremonies, the lowered flags, and the eulogies delivered by the highest officials of the empire were not a celebration of the man, but a celebration of the successful preservation of the royal myth. The establishment gathered to honor a fiction they had painstakingly maintained. As the Duke's coffin was lowered into the earth, the final chapter of the cover-up was sealed. The true narrative of the Edwardian era is not found in the official biographies or the meticulously curated public archives. It is found in the deliberate omissions, the silenced police officers, the disgraced scapegoats, and the empty vaults. The story of the Irish crown jewels is a masterclass in the mechanics of elite survival. It demonstrates that when a ruling class is faced with a choice between the execution of justice and the preservation of its own power, it will dismantle justice without a moment of hesitation. The monarchy willingly paid a ransom of flawless diamonds to a grifter because the alternative was the collapse of their moral authority. They engineered a reality where a devastating theft officially became an unsolved mystery, where a negligent official was destroyed to appease the press, and where a royal duke was forced to bury his own identity to save the face of the sovereign. We examine this dark corner of history not to pass retroactive moral judgment, but to recognize the enduring nature of institutional self-preservation. The Bedford Tower safe remains open in Dublin today. It holds no treasure, no gold, no diamonds. But in its profound emptiness, it holds the absolute truth of the Edwardian age. It stands as a silent, unyielding witness to the terrifying reality that absolute power does not merely write history, it erases it. The passage of time inevitably strips away the grand illusions constructed by empires. More than a century has passed since the morning the Irish crown jewels disappeared from Dublin Castle. The individuals who orchestrated the theft, the monarch who ordered the cover-up, and the men who suffered the consequences have all been reduced to dust. The British Empire itself, which once claimed dominion over a quarter of the globe, has fractured and reseeded into the history books. Yet the anatomy of this specific deception remains a vital lens through which we can examine the brutal mechanics of power and the fragile, often tragic nature of the human experience. The establishment believed that by suppressing the police investigation and sealing the archives, they could control the narrative indefinitely. They assumed that silence would equate to absence, but history has a persistent habit of exposing the voids left by deleted truths. The missing diamonds did not simply vanish. Their absence became a permanent, glaring scar on the historical record, a negative space that eventually outlined the exact shape of the ruling class's hypocrisy. When we look back at the life of John Campbell, the 9th Duke of Argyll, we are forced to confront a profound contradiction. By every metric of the Victorian and Edwardian eras, he occupied the absolute pinnacle of human privilege. He possessed vast wealth, ancient ancestral lands, and a direct marital tie to the most powerful sovereign on earth. He was insulated from the economic hardships and daily struggles that defined the existence of the working classes. Yet this insulation was built on a foundation of absolute psychological terror. His privilege was entirely contingent upon his willingness to live a lie. The moment his authentic self intersected with the draconian laws of his own society, his status ceased to be a shield and became a target. The Duke's survival required the complete suppression of his fundamental nature. The state did not protect John Campbell, the man. It protected the Duke of Argyll, the political asset. The individual was quietly and efficiently sacrificed to maintain the integrity of the institution. This is the quiet, invisible suffering that defined his existence. He was a prisoner locked inside his own public image, forced to stand in the blinding spotlight of royal duty while his actual life was relegated to the perilous, fleeting shadows of an underground network. This inherent tragedy highlights the fragile beauty of human authenticity when it is pitted against rigid, unforgiving systems. The clandestine gatherings at Dublin Castle, despite their association with a ruthless grifter like Francis Shackleton, represented a desperate attempt by marginalized men to find connection and reality in a society that demanded their erasure. They were seeking a space to exist without the suffocating armor of their titles and public obligations. The fact that they had to retreat to the fortified basement of a colonial headquarters to experience a moment of unpoliced humanity underscores the sheer hostility of the world they inhabited. The laws of the era, epitomized by the Labouchere Amendment, were not instruments of justice. They were instruments of systemic cruelty designed to enforce conformity. The Duke's hidden life was not a malicious rebellion against the crown, but a basic human reach for an identity that the crown had explicitly outlawed. The ultimate resolution of the 1907 crisis reveals the terrifying pragmatism of absolute authority. King Edward VII and his inner circle did not weigh the moral implications of their actions. They executed a cold, calculated transaction. They looked at the Irish crown jewels, a masterpiece of history, a symbol of their own divine right to rule, and determined that its value was less than the cost of a royal scandal. They chose to let a national treasure be torn apart by black market jewelers rather than allow the public to see the cracks in the monarchy's moral facade. They allowed an innocent man to be destroyed by public disgrace and let a guilty man walk free across the continent. The establishment demonstrated that it possessed no genuine allegiance to the law, to justice, or even to its own heritage. Its only true allegiance was to its own survival. The government functioned as a self-preservation machine, willing to consume anything and anyone to protect the illusion of its supremacy. Today, we no longer view this saga merely as a sensational true crime mystery or an embarrassing royal footnote. It stands as a definitive indictment of a society that valued reputation over reality and power over people. This event is not a testament to a brilliant heist. It is a monument to a system that was so fragile, so terrified of human variance, that it had to break its own laws and abandon its own treasures just to keep a secret. We honor the truth of this event not to diminish the history of an era, but to recognize the heavy, unseen toll paid by those who were forced to live within it. The legacy of the Duke of Argyll and the stolen diamonds serves as a lasting reminder that justice is rarely blind, that history is frequently curated by the victors, and that the most profound human suffering is often that which is mandated by the state and endured in absolute silence. Today, the Bedford Tower safe remains embedded in the stone walls of Dublin Castle, its heavy door permanently open. Visitors pass by this empty vault, unaware that this hollow space is the most honest monument to the Edwardian age, a physical manifestation of an empire that willingly hollowed itself out to protect its own. The true conclusion to this saga requires us to look past the empty vault and examine the long, brutal shadow cast by the laws of that era. King Edward VII protected his brother-in-law from the immediate terror of the Labouchere Amendment, but the law itself was left entirely intact, continuing to act as a mechanism of state-sponsored cruelty for another 60 years. While John Campbell lived out his days in the protected isolation of his castles, generations of men without titles or royal connections faced the full, devastating force of the justice system. Decades later, the very same legal framework would be used to prosecute and destroy Alan Turing, a man who broke the Enigma code and arguably saved the British Empire from collapse during the Second World War. Turing's monumental contributions to humanity offered him no protection against the rigid moral absolute of the state. He was criminalized for his fundamental nature, chemically castrated, and driven to an early grave. The stark contrast between the fate of the Duke of Argyll and the fate of men like Turing perfectly crystallizes the central hypocrisy of the system. The establishment was never genuinely concerned with morality. It was concerned with optics. It possessed the power to suspend its own draconian rules whenever convenience dictated, yet it mercilessly applied those same rules to crush ordinary citizens who lacked the shield of aristocracy. To fully process the emotional gravity of the Duke's life, we must consider the sheer psychological endurance required to maintain his position. He spent his entire adult life navigating a minefield of societal expectations, constantly aware that a single misstep, a misplaced letter, or a whispered rumor could trigger absolute ruin. There is a deep, fragile beauty in the human drive to seek authentic connection, even under the crushing weight of such systemic oppression. The underground gatherings in London and Dublin were not acts of political defiance. They were acts of human survival. They were the only spaces where a man forced to embody an empire could momentarily simply exist as himself. When Francis Shackleton's blackmail threat destroyed that network, it did not just steal a box of diamonds, it stole the Duke's only avenue to reality. He was forced to retreat into a profound, lifelong emotional quarantine. The photographs that survive from his later years show a man dressed in immaculate military uniforms, his chest heavy with the highest decorations of the realm, yet his eyes often appear distant, guarded, betraying a quiet, hollow resignation. He was celebrated by millions, yet known by almost no one. The medals he wore were awards for a performance, the heavy costumes of a role he could never abandon. Princess Louise, too, remains a tragic casualty of this royal machinery. She was a woman of sharp intelligence and artistic talent, capable of deep empathy, yet she was bound to a marriage that served only the state. The cover-up required her complicity, forcing her to stand publicly beside a man she knew was living a profound lie. Her life became an exercise in silent endurance. Together, she and the Duke formed a perfect, impenetrable facade, absorbing the internal damage to ensure the institution of the monarchy remained pristine. They represent the ultimate sacrifice demanded by elite power, the complete surrender of personal happiness and authentic truth for the sake of public stability. They lived and died within a gilded cage, surrounded by unimaginable wealth, but starved of the basic human right to live openly and honestly. As we reach the end of this narrative, the theft of the Irish crown jewels ceases to be a story about stolen property. The diamonds, the rubies, and the heavy gold insignias were ultimately just minerals and metal, objects assigned arbitrary value by the people who wore them. The true heist of 1907 was the theft of truth. The British establishment looked at the scales of justice, saw that they were tipping against their own interests, and simply broke the scales. They engineered a reality where a devastating systemic failure was repackaged as an unsolvable mystery. They allowed a ruthless opportunist to walk free and destroyed an innocent civil servant, all to prevent the world from seeing the flawed, complex, and deeply human reality of the royal family. They paid the ransom demanded by the blackmailer, and the currency they used was their own integrity. We uncover these buried histories not to drag the past into the mud, but to illuminate the mechanics of power that still echo in our modern world. The story of the 9th Duke of Argyll reminds us that the official record is often just the version of events that the powerful have agreed to tolerate. It highlights the inherent danger of a society that forces its citizens to choose between their fundamental identity and their basic survival. Above all, it stands as a testament to the quiet, unrecorded suffering of those who lived in the margins of history, forced to hide their true selves behind locked doors and heavy titles. This buried history stands as a loud, uncompromising statement about the lengths to which an empire will go to protect its own illusions and the devastating human cost of a truth left forever unspoken. The architecture of forgetting is a meticulous and deliberate construct. When the last contemporaries of the Edwardian era finally passed away, taking the first-hand memories of the Dublin Castle affair to their graves, the silence surrounding the heist underwent a subtle but profound evolution. It transformed from a frantic, panicked cover-up executed by a desperate monarch into an ingrained institutional tradition. The British establishment no longer had to actively suppress Chief Inspector John Cain's files or intercept the frantic letters of a disgraced Arthur Vickers. The suppression simply became the default state of reality. The story of the stolen Irish crown jewels was allowed to drift into the realm of folklore, a quaint, unsolvable puzzle completely divorced from the dark, terrifying blackmail that had actually engineered it. This is how a sprawling empire successfully digests its own sins. It waits for the witnesses to die, it seals the primary documents, and it relies on the passage of time to erode the sharp, undeniable edges of the truth until nothing is left but a harmless myth. The monarchy understood that if you bury a secret deep enough and leave it there long enough, the public will eventually forget that there was ever a shovel involved. If we trace the scattered remnants of this historical collision, we find a landscape defined entirely by absence and anonymity. The flawless Brazilian diamonds and the deep green emeralds, once the shining epicenter of imperial authority, are now entirely untethered from their bloody history. They sit on the fingers of unaware heiresses, or rest in the velvet-lined safety deposit boxes of private collectors who will never know that their prized gems were the currency used to buy a king's silence. The physical components of the treasure survived, but their meaning was completely annihilated. F. Francis Shackleton, widely believed to be the architect of the greatest heist of the century, lies in an obscure, unmarked grave under an assumed name, his phenomenal audacity completely forgotten by the criminal underworld he once navigated. And John Campbell, the 9th Duke of Argyll, rests beneath cold, imposing stone monuments that list his titles, his military honors, and his royal connections, but omit the only truth that ever truly threatened him. Everything that mattered in this story was dismantled, recut, and dispersed, leaving only the polished, impenetrable facade of the institution that orchestrated the erasure. The profound tragedy at the core of this narrative is the realization of what was actually being weighed on the scales of Edwardian justice. On one side rested the physical wealth of a nation, a masterpiece of artistry, and a symbol of sovereign power. On the other side rested the human reality of a single man. The establishment did not choose to protect John Campbell out of compassion, empathy, or secret tolerance for his identity. They protected him purely because his public destruction would have caused unacceptable collateral damage to the crown. In doing so, they revealed a chilling hierarchy of values. The theft of millions of dollars was considered a forgivable offense, a problem that could be managed and swept away. But the existence of a homosexual man within the royal family was viewed as an apocalyptic threat, a sin so unforgivable that the state would rather shatter its own legal system than let it be known. The true crime, in the eyes of the elite, was not the plundering of the safe, it was the failure to conform. As the dust of a century settles over the empty vaults and the sealed archives, the story of the Duke of Argyll and the vanishing diamonds ceases to be a mere historical curiosity. It becomes a mirror, reflecting the enduring, terrifying mechanics of power. The characters are gone, but the system that protected its own at the expense of justice, truth, and human dignity remains a familiar architecture in our modern world. We are left to look at the shadows they cast, recognizing that the most magnificent facades are often built on foundations of absolute silence. As we close the ledger on the most expensive blackmail in royal history, we are forced to confront the chilling calculus of the elite. When the law becomes a weapon for the powerful and a shield for the privileged, and when a nation's heritage is quietly traded in the dark to protect a carefully curated lie, what is the true price of maintaining an empire's illusion